Well, hello, everybody. As she mentioned, my name is Jason Mastrogiovanni, and I realized I probably needed to start off by explaining a little bit of how I come to this work. I've worked in student success and transfer work since about 2007. And there's two concepts that I've become really passionate about, and I didn't know they were going to collide until about 3 years ago. When you kind of get involved in the student success work, you dabble in a little bit of everything, but transfer was one that for me, I was always frustrated, as many of us I think are, of how it's sometimes an afterthought on our campus. So just wanting to be an advocate and being passionate about it, something that has bubbled up over the years. But the other thing that I've been very passionate about in a positive way has been when I've seen collaboration work on my campus, in some contexts very successfully, and in others, that's something I've strove to do. And I've wanted to understand better, how does collaboration work? And, it actually was a conversation with Judith and some of her colleagues at NISTS a few years ago that led me to realize that I would ultimately do this study, which was my dissertation work, actually. But it's something that I continue today, and I'm looking forward to have some dialogue with some of y'all today. I do want to acknowledge, though, that I'm wearing both my practitioner and scholar hat. So I'm going to try not to get overly technical, but I think it's important to understand the scholarship aspect of it, because I think it's something we need to do more as practitioners, particularly in this area, both these areas of collaboration and transfer. But it's going to be easy for me, depending on your questions, and I might even lapse into doing it just out of sheer giddiness of wanting to share with you, my experiences as a practitioner, as well as to why this is so important. So I will try to acknowledge it when I think I'm doing one or the other and it's significant, but I wanted to let you know that I wear both of those hats simultaneously throughout my work. So with that, I'll begin. I want to first acknowledge a little bit about where my study came from. Again, I mentioned that it partnered with NISTS and I was afforded the research grant in 2020 to do this study. You'll find as I explain a little bit more about the study, one of the other big partners was the John Gardner Institute. Specifically, they do a institutional self-study for transfer students, and I was looking specifically at transfer in institutions. They do that for transfer in, which are typically 4-year institutions, and transfer out, which are typically 2-year institutions, not exclusively, but that's often the population they were working with. They helped me identify some of the population. And then one of the guiding principles or thoughts here that I hope we're able to dialogue. I go back to this quote by Handel, and it's been mentioned by other colleagues in the transfer world, this idea of a transfer affirming culture in the 4-year space. And for me, when it comes to collaboration, it's not just about establishing that collaboration, but sustaining it. I think it's very easy for us to get, I'm definitely wearing my practitioner hat at this point when I'm going to say, a couple of our senior administrators together to come and sign an agreement, shake hands, take a photo op, and say, we have collaboration between our two institutions. And you hope it's sustained, right? You hope that there's substance behind that and it perpetuates. But how is it sustained, and by whom, and for how long? So this is some of how I'm approaching this work and how I'm coming to it. So thinking about those two areas, the two things that really spoke to me and where I hope this research can inform the literature, this study, is looking on the collaboration research side. I really wanted to look at internal motivations in context. I wanted to know specifically about group culture and activity culture. What is happening within that environment of a collaboration? I like to say a lot, collaboration is not a noun, it's a verb. So the act of collaboration, what's happening within that context? And then applying, as Judith alluded to, a theoretical context, which I don't believe has been applied to collaboration in higher education yet, at least not in this context. And then coming out of transfer research, something that's been mentioned, especially in the last few years, but this idea that we've scrutinized the heck out of 2-year institutions, but we have not done that nearly as much with 4-year institutions. So that's really where my dialogue with NISTS and my colleagues here have led me to realize that that's something I wanted to focus on specifically. So when we look at this study, and I'm sure you all came for different reasons, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions, but I'm coming at it with a critical approach towards looking at the 4-year institution and that collaboration. That's not to dismiss the 2-year institution or the relationship between the two institutions, but my argument would be is that we haven't scrutinized the 4-year institution enough to understand their motivations and motives in transfer student work. So From the collaborative lens, generally the literature, without getting into too much of literature review, it's moved in these general ways. It's gone from this idea of the whole institution as being a collaborative endeavor to an activity context. So instead of saying my institution is collaborating with your institution, or my institution has a collaboration with a public-private partnership, we're looking at it more in terms of activity now in collaboration literature. So transfer student work is where I've centered that in this study, but it could have been a local internship program. It could have been any activity context that I wanted to really zero in on that a little bit more. Historically, the literature has really focused on senior level when we talk about collaboration research. When you look at the literature, it talks about what can a senior leader do to create a collaborative environment. But more so, the literature now has gotten towards the direction of what groups or individuals are doing. And that was something that was really important to me, because I think as many of us, we don't sit at that senior level leadership table, but how do you affect change and encourage collaboration on your campus? And then I mentioned noun versus verb. I think the terms collaboration and partnership have been used, especially early 2000s and before, really as synonymous with partnership, and almost this idea of we have a collaboration as opposed to we are collaborating. And recently in the literature, this has gotten a lot more attention in terms of how do we collaborate, not just what are the components of a collaborative environment. So that's kind of looking at it from the collaboration lens. But I think the transfer lens, and this is where I'm excited to really talk to this group about, is we know a lot about the two-year institutions, right? We know that aside from wanting to do good for the students and see them be successful, we know that there's a lot of pressure on two-year institutions from national and state performance metrics. It varies a little bit by institution to institution, but two-year institutions are held accountable for that. By and large, four-year institutions are not. That's changing here and there. There's some states that are doing some new things, but we don't really understand that four-year institution motivation very well, or it could be for different things. I have some theories. I think some of you might have some too. I'd love to hear more about that. But what I started off with this, and what was kind of my guiding direction, both for my practitioner experience, but also this article by Strumpel, was really looking at this, one of the few examples of guidance we've given to four-year institutions in terms of what they needed. And I just used two different subsets of groups within a four-year institution that might have differing, maybe conflicting motivations. So you might have an admissions team at a four-year institution that's very cognizant of enrollment streams, right? Maybe they want to increase enrollment, and transfer is a way to do that, a means to an end. But you might have faculty, and I wouldn't say I agree with this, but you might have some faculty that are really concerned about curricular integrity. I'm sure some of you have heard before faculty worrying that the transfer student population is not going to be as knowledgeable in our ways because they haven't been here long enough, and X institution does this with their math class and our math is stronger for this reason. Every institution I've heard that I've worked at, the funny thing is our transfer students have been more successful when we've actually looked at the data. So I always think that one's a misnomer, but I do think that there's these different ideas out there in terms of what are the motivations of the four-year institution. And I would say collectively, these are just two. But as a whole, what is the four-year institution really saying is its motivation, and how is that communicated, and what is shared? I will just share very briefly. I worked in a bridge program between a two-year and a four-year, and that was something our two-year partners said all the time, is they're like, what do you really want out of this partnership? And I was that person in the middle who was communicating to the two-year institution, and it was hard for me to speak for my institution, because the reality was I knew there were probably about 4 or 5 different motivations, and some of them were conflicting. So I think this is something that we need to look at a little bit more. And that's kind of how I got to my purpose, which is wanting to look at the motive directive actions of individual educators or groups of educators at the four-year institution when engaged in cross-institutional transfer activity. So the theory part, I'm going to try to keep this as painless as possible, but I'm really curious if you all have some thoughts. So cultural historical activity theory comes from the social constructivist work of Vygotsky, and it's developed and been translated. There's a lot to go into there that I won't go into, but I will say essentially one of the core concepts that I find most applicable to looking at this is this idea of how the individual engages with the social environment. So in this case, we're talking about how we as practitioners, as professionals, transfer professionals, work within our environment on our campuses to get things done. And Vygotsky, one of the core principles that is held in chat, which we call for short, is this idea of mediated action. And the idea being that the individual might have an intent, myself, it might be very student focused personally, and I'm going to mediate an action in some way, shape, or form, meaning I'll take that thought and I will do something, and that will have an influence on my environment. My environment's going to respond to that in some way and do something, and it's in turn going to have an influence on me. This isn't very different from communication theory. If you look into that, it's this idea of encoding and decoding, right? I might have an idea and intent of this is what we need to do to help our students, and I'm going to encode it in words, and those words are going to be interpreted by the community, maybe in the way that I intended, maybe not in the way that I intended, because it's maybe imperfect. But this is kind of the underlying theory of how I approached my work. And was there a question? All right, I'll keep going. So one of the interesting things about how cultural historical activity theory has looked at this is that it's the idea that it's over history or over time, and then within a context. And that really fits in with what the collaboration research, where it's coming to in its evolution and development as well, is this idea of looking at a contextual environment, but also how it evolves over time. I'm sure we've all been there at some point in our career where an administrator or somebody that we worked with has come along and said, you know, well, what we really need on our campus is X, right? It's this thing that we need to put in. We heard other campuses do X, and we now need to do X, whatever that is. And I've experienced at least that it's not that X is inherently good or bad, whatever it is. It could be transfer articulation agreements. That's actually a really good example of one. It was where I worked on a campus where there were transfer articulation agreements, but there was an external force that was coming forward from the state that said that we needed to do these new pathway agreements. Well, they ended up almost kind of being the same thing, but even the terminology and the history of the two became in conflict over time. So it's not that it was good or bad, but there's all this history of how the environment interacts with the people that are actually doing the work. So the basic theory with cultural historical activity theory here is that we're always kind of influencing each other as we're interacting, and the better we understand that in theory, the better that we could continue to progress activity forward. So I thought that was a good visual just to give you a sense of how I'm approaching this work in cultural historical activity theory. So the study, it was a qualitative case study. I looked at 2 institutions that had gone through the Foundations of Excellence Transfer Self-Study with the John Gardner Institute. And the idea was to collect both some of the reports from that study, and then also interview some individuals from those institutions. With the money given by NISTS, I was able to incentivize those individuals from the campuses, which really helped a lot with recruitment. And then I analyzed first through constant comparative, or a kind of a very regimented qualitative analysis approach, and then activity systems analysis, which is a chat inspired methodology, which I'm going to show you in a broad overview first. So I'm going to click on this just to give you an idea of who the 2 institutions were. So my pseudonymed institutions were private and state. They both completed the Foundations of Excellence self-study in 2019. You see some differences between the 2 institutions. Obviously, one was private, one was public. The private institution partnered, they have kind of a one-to-one relationship with their local community college, and they actually brought them in as partners to that self-study. The state university had many community colleges that they were working with, and they didn't have that direct collaboration research or approach when they did the self-study. You see a little bit slightly different differences in terms of the tuition amounts here and the number of transfer students. But the interesting thing was doing this at the same time, both institutions had pretty similar motives as to why they were doing it. And I'm sure you won't be surprised that a lot of it had to do with enrollment, given the time. That's really what their driving force was behind why they wanted to do the work. Briefly, my participants, I can go back to this more if there are more questions down the road, but I had 5 participants at each campus. I broadly give you some definitions of who they are in terms of what area of responsibility they might have, what level of responsibility they have. So you see middle managers, frontline, and then what their role was with the Foundations of Excellence self-study. So were they just a member? Were they a chair of a committee group? So I had, I think, fairly good diversity of folks from both of those institutions. And then the way I mentioned the analysis, that I did qualitative analysis, and then I went into that activity systems analysis. I started with the document collection. I coded that. I did the interview collection, coded that. And then I put those together and did more focused coding and then selective coding. Very briefly, again, a little bit in the weeds, but I think it's important to see lots of codes generated the first time around. I whittled it down, was able to collaborate or put these things together into larger groups. And then on the third set, this is where activity systems analysis comes in. And now you're saying, what are all these triangles that are on the screen? Well, activity systems analysis is an outgrowth of cultural historical activity theory. And what I think it augments to qualitative research is that it helps you place a lot of complex qualitative data in a framework that embodies this activity in a way where you can start to make new understanding. And I had this experience a couple of times in doing the analysis that I was even surprised that it worked better than I thought it would. But the idea is you take the different aspects of the qualitative data and concepts that you come up with, and instead of just having them and kind of bucket them in random codes, you think about where do they fit within the activity. So a subject is always the person, the position that you're looking from, the vantage point. So often when I'm interviewing folks, they're the subject, right? I'm hearing what their vantage point is. And their object would be their motive. They would be telling me, you know, essentially, why are you engaged in this activity? They're going to express something to me, and that would become their object. They might express other things to me that are motives as we go through the interview, and I would include those as well. But as you're going through the interview data or the document data, other things start to emerge too. One of the most basic tools in this group was the fact that they were all doing the self-study through the John Gardner Institute, but they identified others, committees that were formed, in some cases, a survey tool that they used. And as they talked about those and they were significant to them, I included them in this graphical representation that I had. They might have talked about rules that they were bound by. Those could have been state rules. They could have even been social rules. COVID became a rule for many people because they started this work pre-COVID and they finished it, you know, late 2020 in most cases, and have continued since. So that became a rule that affected how they approached their work. The community, the various people within their community and how they interacted, and then how they divided up labor. Now, what's interesting about activity systems analysis with it, and where the real meaning making comes, is when you lay out things like this graphically, you start to see things that don't fit for some reason or another. Maybe a rule conflicts with the community and somebody expressed that to you. And that's where you get one of these little dotted lines here. So I know it's a lot that I'm showing you all this, but I'm showing it to you because I want to show you where I made meaning out of what the participants said later. So this framework, you can ask more questions about it later, but I wanted to introduce it to you before I start showing you some of the data that I got from the participants. But the basic idea here is that you start to lay out these different qualitative concepts. And as you do that, you can start to see things that you might not have seen in just typical qualitative analysis of the study. So back to my analysis, and we're going forward here, findings. So my research questions. So I specifically was trying to get at, with my questions to the participants in the document analysis, I wanted to know, how could an individual educator in a four-year institution contribute towards collaborative cross-institutional transfer activity? I'm assuming we're all here because we want transfer students' experiences to be better. We might have similar motives, but not everybody at our campus who might come to NISTS or might not come to NISTS might have those same motivations. It might be purely financial from some people on our campus, and that's what their motivation is. I wanted to know how those people were influencing the environment, so I sought those people out. It might be in some ways to preserve something at their institution and changing the student population. Thinking of faculty, sometimes they might have different motives there, and it was important for me to know both those motives that they shared and those where they differed. And then I wanted to know, how did those motives influence the overall outcome at the institution, with the hope of trying to understand and contribute to how can we influence collaborative practice. So spoiler alert, here are the main emerging themes that came out of this study, and I'm going to break each one down. But the primary things that emerged from the literature from almost ever literature from the data from all of the participants was the idea of including others, intentionally including others, the communication, internal perception of progress. And I think this is particularly important for four-year institutions, which I hope to show you, because I don't think we do that enough at four-year institutions, is talking within ourselves to understand what are we trying to do. And then the third thing was really understanding those differences in institutional and educator motivations. And again, how we include folks to make that happen and how we communicate those differences. So let's take a look at the value of including others first. So I want to look on the right-hand side first. We have four main manifestations of the way this came forward. And I'm going to click on the quotes here after I give you an overview, but essentially they learned, or they expressed to me that they were learning from others, and that was valuable when they included different perspectives. They, in some cases, empathize with different perspectives, which I saw as really contributing to that collaborative spirit on their campus. They talked about forming relationships that existed and sustained that collaboration beyond the initial self-study. And then there was also a significant amount of conversation given to voices that were not at the table. So all of that was kind of manifested as overall value of including others. So I want to give you some examples of that. Learning from others. So one of my participants, Valerie, who was at State Institution, talked about just having advisors at the table was so helpful to them. This could have been done at a very high level, but Valerie talked about how there was communication they were trying to have to pre-transfer students, and they kept saying the word, or they had this icon that was supposed to be email, but they realized that advisors were saying, but you're not saying what it is, and the students don't get it. And it seems so small, but because advisors work with the students on a daily basis, they were able to point something out that everybody else working on this process who didn't work with students on a daily basis, worked with systems, couldn't have expressed. They didn't see it. So this idea of including others and learning for others was extremely valuable on their campus. The idea of empathizing with different perspectives. I really loved this participant, Darren. Darren was brand new to private institution. He had been there all of a month when they said, welcome, you're going to be on this Foundations of Excellence transfer self-study, and we want you because you have an outsider's perspective. And one of the things you're going to see about private is that they were extremely inclusive. They talked about being inclusive, so much so, I think it was Darren, a number of participants said this, that they said it was almost nauseatingly so, they were so intentional with wanting to include not just their partners at the community college, but also with being very inclusive on their campus. And they knew that that was just kind of the MO for campus. So what I appreciated about Darren is he talked about how much he valued that as an individual, that he found himself starting to actually advocate for that for the community college when they were not in the room. When they were having an internal conversation back on their campus, they would say, yeah, but what are they getting out of it? And I'll just say, having been in some of these conversations on my four-year campus, that doesn't always happen. So it really stood out to me that I said, wow, Darren, this four-year institution guy who doesn't really have any apparent motivation or incentivization really to care about the community college, cared about the community college because they were so included in the process. He was so aware of their presence even when they were not there. Another example would be forming relationships. Margaret talks about this from private as well. And she talked about how it says a specific title, but basically one of their senior leaders at their campus really took the time to get to know all the people that were on the committee, and they were on a first name basis. So that internal communication that they had on their campus was really enhanced, that they could really talk about issues without having all of these hierarchical barriers that we typically have. And then last but not least, just another example, although this came up multiple times, people specifically talked about students not being involved as much as they would like, but I really appreciated Ingrid from State because she advocated for people to be involved, but she would notice it. She noticed it within the process and said, hey, we really should be involving somebody here, can we? And she took that agency to ask during the process, let's involve this group on our four-year institution that is not talking about transfer and should be. So even through that, she was bringing people together. Oops. Let's go back here for just 1 second. So basic two differences between the two campuses. I already mentioned private included Metro, strong institutional inclusion, and Darren really had that strong feeling there, but they talked about students not being present. When we look at State University, they really appreciated kind of that advisor inclusion, but the perception, one thing that came out was that the perception that the committees were formed by the leaders that people knew. So the folks that were tasked with doing the Foundations of Excellence, they tapped the people on their campus who they knew they could get to serve on a committee, not necessarily the people who needed to be involved in transfer. And that could have been because I didn't quite dig at this in the data, but it could have been because they didn't have the clout to pull those people there, but it could also have been that they didn't know who to ask or didn't really think about it. They said, oh, I know this person and I think they could serve on a committee. So the difference between the two institutions that I saw was, I think private was much more intentional about their inclusion than State was. Let me show you just a quick little example of some of these. So it's a lot, right? You see all this. This is looking at private university as a whole. And you see, I take the perspective of their university leadership in terms of what they know they did, who all their community was. And so one thing is that I mentioned that COVID was a factor. One of their tensions was that COVID restrictions prevented them from really finishing the study they wanted. They wanted to have the study where everybody came together. They had this whole big idea to do a gallery view of all the findings and people to give post-it note feedback. Great plan. COVID hit, it didn't happen. But one of the interesting things about it is, even though they wanted this vetted study and that didn't happen and there was a tension there, trust still was there. Their campus had every participant talked about the trust that they had on their campus, even though that there was things didn't go as according to plan. And you'll see as we get into State University, that wasn't exactly the same case. I mentioned Darren already and how he included his colleagues at Metro. He was thinking about them and realizing that they might have a potential tension here with working with private university, because if their needs aren't being met, what's their incentive to actually come back together? What he found was, and his hope was, is that it would build trust. And he was able to express, and I saw in some of the documents, this actually was something that happened in this relationship. So something about that intentional inclusion it started to pique my interest. And then I mentioned Ingrid at State and how she was advocating for folks. And you can see with this tension, she recognized that the folks who were coming together to do this self-study, they weren't necessarily being included, but she was advocating for those other to be involved. But she noticed that there was skepticism because that intentionality wasn't there. So you're starting to see these differences that I was noticing between the two institutions. So let me go to the next finding. Communication of internal perception of progress. So saw this manifest in a couple of different ways. First amongst kind of the grassroots, then amongst the leadership, and then how some of these external factors influenced it. So let me give you some examples of these. So grassroots, Esther from private was a faculty member, and because of the communication that was happening on her campus about the process, the fact that a lot of people were included as well, she talked about how her faculty were not skeptical, and in fact were very engaged with the process of collaborating with Metro Community College, because they felt like instead of transfer students being brought to their campus who were not prepared, they had active dialogue with their two-year institution counterparts, and they were talking about curriculum from institution to institution. So it was both that institutional inclusion of Metro, but also this idea that they were talking about it on a regular basis. From leadership, another manifestation that Darren noticed at private, and this is a place where I think private was not doing as well, was internal communication. Especially after COVID hit, they felt like they weren't really sure what happened with the self-study. All the plans just kind of fizzled out. But as I mentioned before, there was trust. Valerie from State also noticed this same sort of trend and felt like there was some internal communication. But Valerie was an interesting case because she had, prior to FOE, she had responsibility to communicate to her community college partners. She was that conduit and that outward facing person partnering with the community colleges. But she didn't necessarily communicate internally what was going on, but her two-year partners did know what was going on. So I identified with Valerie thinking about my experience as a bridge practitioner in the past, because she was speaking to those community colleges and knew what was going on, but her four-year institution had a lot of different ideas in terms of what was or was not going on. And lastly, just talking a little bit about Chris here, also from state, he was talking about how the subcommittee reports came in kind of piecemeal at the end. And again, he mentioned that was partially because of COVID, but this idea that the recommendations kind of felt a little disconnected from the piecemeal reports that came in. So basic differences between the two institutions. COVID was a challenge at both, but it seems that grace was given at private university and maybe a little bit less so at state university. There was definitely some skepticism that was built in. But what I appreciated about two of the participants, Esther and Stanley, they felt like they were given a lot of agency to continue that communication and that it could happen more on a grassroots level without everything having to go through leadership or having to wait for leadership. Esther and Margaret also talked about the transparent communication from their leadership. And specifically, there's an activity system I can show you too from Esther, where she talked about tenure and knowing that she was going to get credit and acknowledgement for being a part of this process, which is often a big issue at four-year institutions. And then at state, there was some breakdown in communication about that final report, and it seemed very leadership voiced. As I mentioned, that Darren had given, or not Darren, Chris had given some skepticism to that. And then I mentioned Valerie's role, which I do want to, I'm being cognizant of time. I want to show you a little bit about Valerie, because I think she was one of the most interesting participants in this way. I mentioned she was the community college outward facing person, but after FOE happened, she was one of the co-conveners for it. She took up leadership of a transfer implementation group. And in that transfer to implementation group, she was kind of convening the entire four-year institution to make things happen. But she never kind of switched out of that external communicator role to that internal communicator role. So she could both acknowledge that things were missing in terms of internal communication, but she didn't necessarily feel empowered to do something about it. And that's where, had I not done this type of analysis, I don't know that I would have recognized it. Many participants at State University said internal communication was a problem. Valerie was the only one who I thought was in a position to actually do anything about it. And I think being very clear about those roles and very intentional about who's supposed to be responsible for internal communication is something I don't know that I would have picked up on as a role for transfer work. For time's sake, I'm going to go, whoops, I'm going to lose my screen is what I'm going to do. Sorry about that. The differences in institutional educator motivations. I already kind of mentioned this, but that enrollment, institutional finances were a common theme. All the participants said that's why they were doing transfer work. But private was a little bit more sensitive to the community college and what their individual participants wanted. And educator motives varied quite a bit, but it was often not enrollment. It was specifically more around things that were intrinsic to them, personal, or also very focused on the students and the student outcomes. So what do we take from all this, or what are the implications? So this is where I want to continue to explore in the transfer realm. I think I would say from this study, we could say that intentional inclusion may build trust within the four-year institution activity, or another way to look at it is the intentional or unintentional exclusion of groups may instill skepticism within that four-year institution. Generally speaking, as I mentioned, private was very intentional about that inclusion, and it seemed to have a trust-building effect on their campus. And then state, which I think was less intentional about it, or at least there was evidence that they excluded groups in the process of bringing people together. There was a lot of skepticism that was built within their institution. Second, I think that lack of internal communication may instill skepticism. I felt there was a little bit about that from all the participants at both institutions. But again, as I mentioned, private was a little bit more forgiving. And I think that's kind of the other thing that the third finding here is this idea that intentional inclusion may defend against the establishment of skepticism within the four-year institution activity. So what does all this mean? Well, I think for me, it goes back to that point of the four-year institution and what do we really know about it when it comes to transfer work. We know there's a lot of different motivations, but how do we bring people together to transparently talk about this? And I think as we progress, and I hope many of you might be inspired to go and do that work, as well is to scrutinize our four-year institution and being very clear. I've personally, putting on my practitioner hat, I've seen where a lot of people get excited around a new partnership that's coming up. We all get together, we have a big meeting, we celebrate, there's pictures, there's a news story on the website, we're going to partner with this community college or whatever. And then it kind of fades, right? Or the devil's in the details. And as we get working with our partners, we realize, oh, wow, maybe we didn't iron this piece out, or maybe we don't have a good structure, or maybe this aspect of the four-year institution is no longer present in that collaboration. How do we sustain it? And surprisingly to me, I think this idea of intentionally including throughout and communicating internally specifically is something I've taken to heart even as I was doing this literature in my own work now. And I've realized that power of intentionally communicating to folks just what you're doing, even if what you're doing is waiting on something. And in the case of both institutions, they were waiting on kind of COVID stuff to sort out, right? It wasn't the biggest priority in many cases at both institutions, but I know at State, several of them, because I interviewed them a year and a half out from this process, several of them at that point felt like the transfer stuff was done. Like it happened, it's that assessment report on the shelf and somebody's not going to, maybe somebody will pick it up, but probably not. They thought it was over. How do you continue to do this? But that internal communication of just, hey, what are we doing, has a really significant effect. The intentional inclusion, right? Sometimes we'll bring people together and say, well, we don't want to get any detractors at the table, right? No, we want to bring the people who have critical perspectives as well. It's going to be tough, but we'd rather have those perspectives at the table now so that we can engage with people and hear those different perspectives. But the way the two interplayed with each other was interesting to me as well. So it's one study. I want to do more. I want to engage more, but I thought it was a good place to start. Where I want to just connect and end off with the literature is, and where I'm a little critical about, and I want to look more in depth, is this idea of structures versus collaborative practice. There's a couple places in the literature where we talk about things that can be done in a four-year institution to enhance transfer. This idea that we could have an advisory board. I don't think those things are bad. I would just argue that perhaps we also need to think about how are we going to collaborate? Because just having the structure does not necessarily make the collaboration successful. Just having a governing board doesn't make it successful if it's all made up of, let's say, enrollment folks or only curriculum committees. How do all those folks talk together? And then something that hasn't come up as much in the literature, but I want to see more of, is this idea of defining those internal and external roles and how they interplay. I had to reflect on my positionality on this a lot, because for me, I really thought it was going to manifest kind of more of in a student affairs, academic affairs, faculty way, and it wasn't. It really was what people were tasked to do. And the case of Valerie, I think, was a perfectly good example, is that in her mind, she was external communicator, but the campus started to look to her as the transfer person. So if you're the transfer person, what's your responsibility? And it didn't really matter where her position sat or what silo she might have been part of at the institution. And Adrian and Chris were two of the other participants at State that really helped me understand that, by understanding that Valerie was in charge of this transfer implementation group, but yet didn't see herself in that role. And then on the collaborative practice side, and this is, I think, could be applied to anything, not just transfer, but I like to share it. There's a couple of important concepts that are talked about in collaboration literature that I think relate back to inclusion and trust, or that internal communication. Boundary spanning, or border crossing, bilingual, bicultural. There's a couple different concepts that come up in the literature that talk about this idea of inclusion and how it can enhance collaboration or enhance work in our institutions. And I think there were a number of participants in the study that really spoke to that. I want to just point out Ingrid for a moment as well. She was the one who kept bringing people back into and including them into the group who were originally excluded. She talked about herself as an expert generalist. And I really liked that, because she had this like outwardly facing idea of all the people that potentially touch transfer students, and wanted to know, how do we bring all these people together to help the transfer student? And that was not how her institution was approaching the work. This idea of empathetic perspective taking really builds off of Ben Simon and Neumann's work, which I haven't seen a lot more in collaboration research talking about it, but they argued you couldn't get to these higher level cognitive functions until you really had those organizational structures in place. And then the perception of progress, it comes up a couple of times in collaboration literature, but this idea of attending to culture, I didn't know what that meant, or at least I thought I knew what it meant. And as I dug into it a little bit more, I wonder if part of that is really attending to the individuals within your culture and really keeping them involved in what's going on and communicating to them even the small level of progress. So I know that's a lot to get into, but are there questions or thoughts about all this or things that you all would like me to go back to?
Jason, I'll kick it off while people are thinking. I think there's so many implications to your work, and I just think of collaborations that I've been a part of that have gone awry, and you don't really understand why. And so it's really helpful to think about some of the sometimes even just really not easy things, but sort of straightforward of just remembering to communicate about what's going on and thinking about who you're including. In your work, I know you gave some specific examples. I'm curious if in your thinking you came across any tools or kind of types of trainings or kind of, I don't know, I think about like how there's meeting facilitation training and different things like that. I don't know if anything comes to mind that you feel like supports what you found is helpful and needed.
Sure. I think I have a couple thoughts on that. One is I had a conversation with the John Gardner Institute about this about a month ago, shortly after I completed the study. And it's something that I think they do a pretty decent job in their process of talking to folks on. What they're concerned about is it's sustaining. I think they have the controls on how to do that during the process. They really instill that through the structured way that they do that, but they're really concerned about what happens after they leave. And I think it's, in some ways it is an outsider perspective, but it's also, it's that Ingrid. Honestly, the Ingrid, she's one of my favorite participants. You're not supposed to have favorite participants, but she excited me because she felt so passionate about it and took the social capital to speak up and say, hey, we should include this person. So I think, I started this out thinking as an individual, how can I affect change? And I would argue all of you who are on this call, you've had those moments of knowing when you should do something, and I hope you have spoke up. But I think part of it is taking that initiative to do that and not being afraid to do it. But that's easy to say. It's not always easy to do in your political environment.
I'll just jump in because that is exactly what we're addressing with what we're calling the Transfer Advocacy Toolkit. And I'll just alert folks, there's one of the group conversations is with Mark Allen Poisel, and it is that you may not understand from the title what it's about, but it's talking about sustained transfer advocacy. But it's exactly what you just said, Jason, of how do I speak up, kind of have the courage to speak up, and how do I speak up effectively? So I would encourage folks to check that out, and we're going to have more resources related to that rolling out this year. So yeah, that's definitely a piece.
Well, and I would also add too, I think that's something we're struggling with in higher ed overall. That's kind of, I didn't know for sure that I wanted to do the transfer context. It really became apparent about 3 years ago that it made sense to do it, but I wanted to understand, how do we collaborate better on our campuses? And I don't feel like we've answered that in the literature very well. We've talked about what collaborations look like, what we think good collaborations look like, but we don't really talk about how to do it, or we're just starting to talk about how to do it. And I honestly think people need to take the time to write up more case studies, in whatever form. I mean, this is a theory that made sense for me and made sense with my graduate work, but I think there's many other ways to approach it, because I'd love to see not just more collaborative practice studies, but collaborative practice studies in transfer, because these are just two cases. I'd love to see if somebody else finds similar things. And this emerged from my participants. If somebody else were to do another study that was with foundations or without foundations of excellence. I'd love to see if they found similar things, because I just don't think we're talking about the practice as much. I think we all try to do good, and we probably are doing, you know, as good as we can on our campuses. But I think the power behind writing it down and showing what different people experience, I think will build momentum on our campuses for collaboration.
Definitely. And I would just mention from an NISTS perspective also that we are very supportive and want to be a resource for folks that are interested in doing that kind of practitioner scholar research. So please reach out to us if you think, hey, you know, maybe I would like to do something like that. I know Jason also would be glad to chat with you. And also I wanted to mention, Jason was a recipient of our Research Grant Award. We alternate between the Research Grant Award and the Dissertation Award from year to year. So the next year we'll be doing the Dissertation Award. So keep an eye out for that if you're a graduate student and or if you're just doing research. So I think we can wrap it up there. Thank you all for attending, and thank you, Jason, again for your research and for this great conversation connecting the theory and practice together. So thank you so much.